Mustafa, there were so many places I wanted to take this conversation when I was studying your LinkedIn profile, and there were things I want to talk about, all the major corporations you work for, and the corporate success. But I'm actually gonna scale this back, because I think the foundational decisions we make in life often have ripple effects throughout the rest of our careers, our lives. And the two in particular that I want to go dig into, because they really caught my eye. But the one I want to start with is, you came to this country at 14.
Yes.
Which means, like, I'm imagining you had to grow up pretty fast. So, maybe we can start there. You're 14 years old. You're where? Where in the United States are you, and what's going through your mind?
First of all, thank you, Ruben, for having me as a guest. This is great. You and I have connected several times, and really looking forward to it. And I had a feeling you to go there. It's actually part of the story I usually don't share a lot, so yeah. I'm happy to go there. I think I will tell you, when I was 14 and I came to the US, let me just share with you that process, if you don't mind, because actually that will help figure out, right? I remember literally landing in Chicago on a Friday evening, and I started high school on a Monday.
Wow.
And it was such a big transition, because I was born and raised in India, Bombay. And I had to very quickly I just remember the first week or the first month was just such a blur, because it was just helping me transition to there's just new ways of everything, right? Every fundamental thing that I had learned growing up, I had to now rethink about it and reevaluate. And in many ways, it really helped me. Like you said, it really helped me grow up really quickly, really fast.
Yeah.
But I will tell you, it was a lot of fun too, because I think that rapid change, that rapid evaluation it's something that I carry with me throughout the rest of my life, right? It's one of the reasons why I've done I've been in 20 different jobs, 20 different professions, because I like that rapid learning concept.
Yeah, for most people, initiation into high school can be a little rough. And then on top of that, you got culture shock, right? So you're like, what I'm hearing you say is you didn't have time to sit around and overthink a lot. It was kind of, get on with it, sink or swim. I got to adapt and grow. Is that correct?
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. The word that you mentioned is adaptability, and that is absolutely true, right? It was either I had time to say, oh my God, things are different, and what do I do? Or it's almost like, well, it is what it is. I now need to just change, or I need to do things differently, or I need to think things differently. And so I never focused on what was left behind. It was almost focused on what can I do to make the most of what is going on here, or what I have given the opportunity that's been given to me. And it was great, right? I learned a lot. I ended up making a ton of friends. It was a rough, granted, it was a rough year, all in all. But it was an experience that I take back with me all the time. And I go back to some of those experiences. In fact, I tell my kids about it too, is, that level of change and forcing yourself to be in this new situation in which you're completely uncomfortable with, is great for just overall development. Forget about just career, just as a person, as being around it, right?
Yeah.
And the one thing that I learned the most about it, and by the way, it took me a long time when I was reflecting back, I finally realized, is it really taught me to be comfortable in uncomfortable situations.
Right. Yeah.
And that's one. I kept that with me as I kept doing more and more. And it's one of the reasons why I keep doing different things all the time, because I like being in these uncomfortable situations, because in my opinion, that's when you grow the most, right? In fact, you have no choice but to grow.
Yeah, it's kind of like shock leadership lessons coming young. Like a little bit of trauma actually was really good for you, right? It kind of made you feel anti-fragile or resilient.
Yeah, actually, yeah.
Not that necessarily 14, you were thinking about it in those terms, but looking back.
Of course not. I was just, when you're 14, even the decision to come to the U.S. was, when you're I think we decided when I was 12 or 13, I had this conversation with my dad, and he's like, listen, we have the opportunity to go. would you like to go? And it was not just like, would you like to go, but would you like to go by yourself? It wasn't even with the family.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
And so even when you're 12 and 13, you don't realize the implications of these kind of things. You never do, right? And at that time, I'm like, sure, why not? And not knowing what I was saying yes to. And it just happened so rapidly. And I was very lucky, by the way. Don't get me wrong. I was fortunate because I came into a very loving family in the U.S. with my uncle and aunt, and they were very kind.
Right.
They were very kind to put me up. I had a great support system. I had all the benefits that you can think of. And so it worked out. I consider myself very actually lucky and fortunate to be given that opportunity to do that.
Yeah, I mean, did this start? My perception of you, Mustafa, is that you're somebody who views the world a little differently than a lot of folks around you. You just connect dots a little differently. That's part of your brilliance. Do you think this was this kind of like two cultures, two different ways of doing the world, blending those led to some of that?
Yeah, and actually, yeah, like anything else, Ruben, you're a great observer. What I actually found out is, so first of all, you're right. I do look at things a little bit differently.
Yeah.
And what I found out later on in life is that I am slightly dyslexic.
Interesting. Okay.
And so because of that, I actually see things a bit differently than most people do, or at least I connect the dots differently. And that just allows me, I consider it a superpower, to be honest with you. Because it just, just a slight variation in how people look at things has allowed me to do a lot of awesome things, right? And I'm sure part of it, when you're 12, 13, 14 going through it, I'm sure some of it played behind. It only at later years when you start uncovering what really happened, you start to kind of make sense of it all, right? But in that moment in time, like you said, it was a shock. But it didn't feel like a shock at that time. It just felt like, okay, you got Monday, you got to figure out how to go through Monday. Then you have Tuesday, then you have Thursday, Wednesday. Then you have Thursday, and you just keep doing one day at a time, and suddenly you realize, oh my God, a month has passed. And then you realize a year has passed. And then you look back and say, oh my God, think about how much I've grown, how much things have changed, how much I've learned. And it's always shocking when I look back and see that rapid amount of change.
And obviously, you had some academic success. You built some good confidence. You built friendships. You had some academic success.
Yeah.
You can't has. And the reason I bring that up is because you ended up at Rutgers University, which is a fabulous school. It's actually one of the oldest universities in the country. I didn't realize that. It's like you, James Gandolfini, Milton Friedman, Elizabeth Warren, and you, right?
Maybe not in the same pedigree, but it's a fantastic school, yeah.
But it is a fantastic school. And so you had the confidence then within 4 years to not only apply for one of the top academic institutions in the country, but also go there and thrive, right? I mean, their engineering program is quite rigorous. It's not a cakewalk. So you get to Rutgers. Tell us a little bit about that experience, transitioning again within a relatively short amount of time.
Yeah, so I came here when I was 10th grade, so I had about 3 grades to get 3 years to kind of prep for college. And of course, at that moment in time, I had no idea what it meant to even apply to college. And so that itself was a process. But again, shout out to all the school counselors who sat down with me for hours and hours and hours and helped me get through it. But Rutgers was another fantastic experience. And it was one of those things in which I'm like, okay, I think I like engineering. Let me try it out. And it actually worked out to be a really great experience. And in many ways, I didn't know it at that time, but it was almost like replicating what happened when I was 14. Yeah. You put yourself in a brand new situation. Yeah. You don't know what you're getting yourself into. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to just make the most out of what is given to you or the opportunities that are given to you. Right. And I've just found out that over and over again, that theme has repeated several times. And I think I do the best, or I thrive in those environments. And same thing with Rutgers, like you said, I remember starting off, that our first lecture with the professor, and he's like, you know what, look left and look right. Chances are those people are not going to make it through engineering. Just because it was such a crazy program to go through. And they were right, because I think by the time we graduated, we had shrunk by about 70 to 80% of students who had left engineering just because of that program. So
did that scare you or motivate you? Did that statement scare you or motivate you, or maybe both?
I'm not sure if it actually, to be honest with you, it was just like, I'm not sure if I had either one of those emotions.
Okay.
It was more like, okay, it's going to be a tough program. Let's just see how I do.
Yeah.
Right. At the end, and I'll tell you a weird story. By the time I was in third year of engineering, I absolutely loved the program.
Yeah.
Like, I loved learning about it. I loved the mechanics of it. I loved the class, the science, the math behind it. But I had this epiphany at third year in which I said, I love engineering, but I can never be an engineer.
Oh, that's interesting.
Right.
Okay. Was there some dying to yourself in that statement? I mean, was that something that just came to you right away, or did that evolve? Did that realization?
I think it evolved over time because when you're third year and you're starting to think about, okay, what happens after fourth year?
Right.
And I started looking around and went through all of these open houses with schools hiring engineers and so on and so forth. And the more I started talking to them about what they do on a day-to-day basis, the more I realized that is not who I am.
Right.
The thing that engineering taught me, which I think is probably the most important lesson, is problem-solving skills.
Yeah.
Right. How do you define a problem well?
Yeah.
Right. And then how do you go about solving it in a methodical fashion? And to me, that is what I bring out of the engineering classes. Of course, by now, I don't know much about thermodynamics, aerodynamics, and all that fun stuff that I learned. But that's what I got out of that program, is just the mindset about how do you define the problem well? Because I think defining the problem well is probably the most important aspect.
Right.
And then coming up with a solution becomes much easier.
Yeah.
And so at third year, I realized that, you know what, I can't be that person who sits in front of a computer screen, doing AutoCAD, perfecting the dimensions of a screw or some bolt or whatever it is that needs to be designed just perfectly, right? I need to do something different.
Yeah.
I didn't know what that different was, but I knew it was not this. And so that actually that took me to a whole different...
Well, yeah, I want to jump into that because I think it's awesome, especially if somebody studies your LinkedIn profile, because it's such it's seemingly an outlier, but I think it informed a lot of the other things that you did. You became a door-to-door salesman, selling paper, right? And in many ways, it was like running your own business right out of college, because you were responsible for the whole entire P&L and life cycle and activities. But it's one thing to say, okay, I'm not going to be an engineer. I don't want to sit in front of a desk for 12 hours a day. It's another thing to jump into that. What happened? I mean, like, well, how do you bridge those two worlds?
Yeah, that's so that itself is an interesting story. So on my journey of trying to figure out what to do next, I started asking people, like, what's the opposite of what mechanical engineering does?
Yeah.
Right. And somebody said this to me, and it kind of stuck with me. They said, well, the opposite is being a salesperson. I'm not sure why they came up with that, but that stuck to me. And I'm like, okay. So I had that in my mind, and then suddenly, it's year 4. I have another week to go. I'm in my final exams. I get a call from home, and I get a call from my mom saying that my dad just had a stroke.
Oh, okay.
And so they said, and I'm like, oh, and so that changed my world completely.
Yeah.
My dad is the one who actually had the paper products company in New York. Okay. It was a very small operation. And literally, I finished, that day onwards, I had one more exam to go. I finished the exam. And the next day, I started off as a salesperson doing door-to-door sales. And if you can imagine that situation in which, my dad, unfortunately, is in the hospital. We're really worried about him. He has a business in which he's running that, he really he had a few employees, but that's about it. But he was really he was everything, right? He was the CEO, the salesperson, the whole thing. You can think about it as a mom and pop business. And I had to literally step into that.
Yeah.
And then first learn how the heck do you do this? Because I'm like 20 years old, 21 years old. I've never sold anything in my life.
Yeah.
Let alone run a business with all the other things that are happening on the side. And so it just forced me to then learn a new skill about going door to door. That was my dad's business, and he was very successful at it, in which he had these mom and pop stores he built great relationships with, and he would just sell them paper products in New York City. And his entire beat was to go door to door, collect orders, get orders, and expand the business. And I will tell you, it has been, from a career perspective,
yeah,
I learned so much in that year and a half, because after that, we ended up, or in 2 years after that, we ended up selling the business. My dad unfortunately passed away. Mm-hmm. But I learned so much in that 2 years about people, about sales, about working in New York City. Right. It was fantastic. I had such a good time. And I take those lessons back all the time. I always tell people, if you ever have a chance in your life, doesn't matter what you are, you should be a salesman, at least for a short amount of time.
Yeah, right?
Because otherwise, you just don't see, you can't, it's such a different perspective.
It's hard to understand the psychology if you haven't lived it. It's such it can be brutal at times. And I've had that experience as well. And I'd imagine that would be a pretty interesting experience to have that with your dad, to have shared that with your dad, especially since he's passed away, that you got to have that experience with your dad.
Yeah,
and walk a mile in his shoes.
I'm sorry?
And walk a mile in his shoes.
Yeah, it was eye-opening, to say the least, right? And in many ways, unfortunately, I almost wish that I had done a bit more with him, because, I used to help him in the business during the summer.
Yeah.
Right. So it wasn't like it was a completely unknown quantity.
Yeah.
But I realized how much I did not know.
Right.
Right. And so the gap of what I used to do in the summer and helping him versus me taking on full time, and like you said, running the P&L, right?
Right.
The first thing I had to do in week, because my dad used to pay his employees every week, is I had to make payroll.
Oh yeah.
Right.
That's a lot of responsibility.
Yeah, it's not easy. And at that time, my dad was the only breadwinner in the family.
Yeah.
And so we had to take care of my dad and all the stuff that goes with having a stroke. And unfortunately, he was in the hospital for almost a good year and a half. Right. Okay. So it was a long process.
Yeah.
And so his recovery was very slow.
Okay.
Take care of my dad, take care of my mom. I had two younger brothers that I had to take care of too, who were very young. And on top of that, you bring in the aspect of running a business that I had no idea what I was doing.
Right.
And on top of it, add the pressure about this is the only revenue source for the family. It was quite a bit, right? But that's why I say it was by far the best learning experience I've ever had.
I'm sure.
And it was just. And the other thing, coming back to what you said, is being a salesman is, being a salesman makes you learn how to be comfortable with failure.
Yeah.
Which I think was a really good lesson for me.
That's right. Yeah.
Right? You get rejected so many times.
Right.
It worked out. It worked out really well. And you just said, okay, you get rejected. You just have to just get better and better at what you're doing, right?
Well, it's interesting. Words are coming up for me, Mustafa, like, baptism of fire and a hero's journey. And there's all kinds of great, little slogans that are coming up for me as you're speaking. Any final words of advice for anyone who, maybe they've had a career that hasn't looked, like the prototypical career. They've taken some unusual twists and turns. So they might end up taking some unusual twists and turns, right? Any final words of advice for somebody like that on how to?
I think that's a good question. I'll give you three that we touched on, right?
Please.
Number one is just being comfortable being uncomfortable.
Yeah.
I think a lot of folks have a really hard time being that. And if you just say to yourself, it's okay to be uncomfortable, I think that makes a big difference. I think the ability to either learn quickly or adapt or whatever, or flexibility, whatever you want to call it, I think that is key, because instead of talking about why things are the way they are, you just accept things as the way they are and then take the advantage the best that you can find. Try to always find that advantage and learn from it is the second one. And the third one is what we just mentioned, is just being comfortable with failure, right? Even now, when I help companies build products, I said, listen, you have to go through a lot of wrongs to get right. And so if you're worried about getting a lot of wrongs or failing, you're never going to build the right product, right? And so being able to be comfortable with failure and learning from it, I think is key.